Thank you guys for leading us in the music. I appreciate you guys having the volume loud enough that I can sing as loud as I want and not worry if I am off key. I came in this morning when they were warming up and they were talking that someone was a half beat off, and I'm back here going, "Huh? What are they even talking about?" And I said something to someone else, and they said, "Yeah, I'm with you. I couldn't tell the difference, but I appreciate what you guys do to lead us in worship." Good to see you here this morning. One of the difficult things about preaching is determining where to go with a certain passage. You're given a passage to preach on. Sometimes it just depends on the church, the location, the timing, but you're given a passage to preach on, and there's so many different ways you could go. And so I was off and running on a sermon for this week, and it just seemed like I was too far ahead of where I wanted to be. And as I continued studying and continued to listening to some other sermons, I listened to a sermon and I thought, whoa, 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 that's where I need to be. And so I kind of backed up, and I'm basing some of this sermon on some other sermons I heard, including one by a man named Jeff Mannion. But next week, I'm going to continue on with what I had started, but not here. So this is actually a two-part series. You only get one part. And if you want the second part, you can either come to Westchester next week, where I'll be doing the first part today and the next part next week, or you can listen to it on their Facebook page, or I've got all my sermons on podcasts as well. And so you can go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and you'll be able to find it there once I'm done. If you're new here, if you're visiting, if you don't know who I am, my name is Curt Wyse. My wife Dawn and I, we own and operate JW's Foods. We've been there a long time. Dawn has been working there. She's been being paid to work there since she was 14. She tells me she was working there long before that. I've been working there. I've been being paid to work there for over 20 years. I was actually doing stuff before that. When I was in college, Dawn and I got married before my senior year, and I had some computer projects to do. I was actually writing computer programs for the grocery store that didn't have a computer yet, but we were going to get one because we had some things that we wanted to do. So that was actually my introduction to the store. And so before before I started working there, it belonged to Dawn's parents. And so our kids grew up in the grocery store, right? It was their second home. They knew it inside out. And there's a big difference between having a family business and growing up in a family business. Our kids, they grew up in the family business. And so whether that would involve playing flashlight tag when the store was closed, or whether it was dinner conversations about the store and about customers and about business, or whether it was just helping with special projects, things that needed to be done that were after hours, or maybe they weren't after hours, depending on the day. Our kids ended up knowing a lot about the store, more than some of our employees, and they also enjoyed some of the perks because they knew where everything was, right? They knew their way around the back room. They would go places that many of you have never been in the grocery store. They'd be in and out of the kitchen. They'd go back and they would help themselves to some Pepsi or something. And if somebody was visiting, if someone was in the store that didn't know what was going on, they might have looked at him and said, "Who's that kid that thinks they own the place?" Right? Who is that kid? And so, is that, are we working this morning? We are. Now we are. The back one is not. That's okay. I'll figure this out. Instead of a grocery store this morning, our setting is going to be the tabernacle. About 1,000 years before Christ, a long time, 1,000 years before Christ, the Israelites, they had come up out of Egypt. And in Egypt, they had no place to worship. They barely even knew who God was or about God. They'd come up, and in the wilderness, God gave them instructions on how to build this tabernacle, how to build this tent. And that was where they would go to meet God. That was their synagogue, their church building, whatever you want to call it. That is where God was. The tent, it wasn't located in Jerusalem. That's where the temple was built, but that's like 100 years later. So this is before the temple is built. They had this tent, and it was located in a place called Shiloh. And so if you would have gone to Shiloh, if you would have gone to the tabernacle of God, you might have looked around and you would see this young kid running around. And you would say, "Who is that kid? What's up with him?" And somebody who knew, maybe someone from the area, they would have told you that that was Samuel. And they would have told you the story about Hannah, his mother. His mother had been unable to have children. She had come to the tabernacle and she had had a meltdown. I mean, she had had a total meltdown right there in the tabernacle. And she was pleading with God to give her a child. And God had answered that prayer. God had answered that prayer. And when she had that child, she said she was going to dedicate him back to God. And as soon as he could eat on his own, as soon as he was weaned, maybe 3, maybe as late as 4, she had brought him back to the tabernacle and dedicated him there to work in the tabernacle. So every year then she would bring him a new garment, a new set of clothes, and she would come and visit him. Now, if you're going to drop your 3 or 4-year-old off somewhere and leave him there for someone else to raise, the church, the tabernacle might have been a pretty good place, right? I mean, you would have some good influences. You would have some priests. You would have people who feared God, people who worshiped. You would have lots of worship, lots of prayer, lots of religious teaching. But yet we've all heard stories in our own time frame, in our own culture, about evil going on within the church as well. Think about some of the abuse of young boys in the churches. And so when Samuel was dropped off at the tabernacle, a man named Eli was the high priest. Eli was the priest, and his 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were also the priests. They were kind of in charge of the day-to-day operations of the tabernacle, if you want to say it that way. But let's say that these 2 guys were not guys that you would want your daughter dating, right? You probably wouldn't want your young 4-year-old child hanging out with them either. These guys they were bad guys. 1 Samuel 2:12, it says, "The sons of Eli were scoundrels. They had no regard for the word of the Lord, for the Lord." Now, that's the NIV version. Most of you probably didn't know the word scoundrel was in your Bible. And if you're using a different translation, it might not be. But if you're using a different translation, it probably says they were worthless men. They were despicable men. They were evil men. They were corrupt men. Or they were useless men. Some of you might have a translation that says they were sons of Belial, which is an idiom meaning they were their personification of evil. Right? It doesn't get much worse than that. That's who these guys were. You get the idea. And it says they had no regard for the Lord. And again, other translations say they didn't know the Lord, they didn't acknowledge him, or they didn't respect him. But these are the guys who were in charge of the spiritual life of Israel. These are the guys that were the religious leaders. And that's the environment that young Samuel was dropped into a place of worship where the leaders didn't worship, into a tabernacle full of religious hypocrisy. And so when we look at Samuel's faithfulness, it's not just that Samuel was faithful, it's where he was faithful. Right? It's not just that he was faithful, it's that he was faithful there. He was faithful there in the midst of all of this that was going on. Maybe there's times in your own life that you felt the same way. You're in a place where it's really difficult to be a faithful follower of Jesus. And we sang this morning about the storms and God is still being there. Right? Maybe that's where you're at right now and you're saying, "Man, it's hard here. It's hard to be faithful here." Maybe it's your work environment. Maybe you're in a work environment where you're not free to talk about God. Maybe you're in a place where no one else believes, where people think that Christians are just a bunch of ignorant hypocrites. Maybe you're in a place where you can be disciplined for talking about God or sin or anything in between. And you're thinking, man, it is hard to be faithful, and it's really hard to be faithful here. Sometimes we just end up in places, in environments that are not conducive to our growth, and faithfulness is hard. But hang in there. Hang in there. Because this morning we're going to look at Samuel and his faithfulness in a difficult place, and we're going to contrast it to what was going on around him. We're going to contrast it, and we're going to go back and forth between Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, these worthless scoundrels who had no regard for God, and back and forth with Samuel. But Hophni and Phinehas, they were the priests, right? And so you're thinking, well, how bad can they really be? They were the priests. How much trouble could they really cause and get into? Well, a lot. A lot. Because see, people would travel to the tabernacle, to Shiloh, to make things right with God. If you had sinned, if you had done something wrong, if you had hurt someone, sinned against someone, said the wrong things to someone, whatever you did that was wrong, you would go to Shiloh, to the tabernacle, to make a sacrifice, to get restored in relationship with God and your neighbor. You'd come to the tabernacle to make things right, come to make peace with God. And you would bring a lamb, you'd bring an offering to sacrifice. Now, when you did the offering, you didn't just put this meat on and just let it char up like sometimes happens on your grill, right? You're not paying attention, and next thing you know, your bratwurst are just a charred mess, and it's time for Plan B for supper. No, you would put it on, and the fat would come off. As the fat burned off, the fat was the portion that was to God. And then the rest of it would be divided. Some of it would go to the priest, some of it you would eat yourself as this meal. And part of the joy of the sacrifice was taking then this meal knowing that your sins had been forgiven, right? That you were restored to right standing with God. So that's the background now for our first scene. Our first scene, starting in chapter 2, 15, and it says, even before the fat was burned, the priest's servants would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, give the priest some of the meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, only what is raw. So you'd be there knowing that you're supposed to make the sacrifice to God, and the fat portion is supposed to go to God, and the guy shows up with a steak knife and he says, hey, I'll take my steaks now. I'll cook them myself. And you're like, no, we can't do that. That's not the way this is supposed to work. You can't have your part before God gets his. And if the person said to him, let the fat be burned first and then take whatever you want, the servant would say, no, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force. See, these guys that were working for the priest, they were thugs. This was the one place you would go to make things right. And everything was so wrong. If you had ripped somebody off and you were sorry about it and you wanted to get right again, you would go there and make an offering, and then you're there and someone's ripping you off. But that's not all. Because at the tabernacle, there were various women who were working there as servants as well. And some of the women, they would catch the eye of Hophni or Phinehas. Or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe Hophni and Phinehas, maybe they would catch the eye of the women. And you can imagine where this is going. You're going, oh no, not in the tabernacle, not in church. That's so wrong. Yeah, it's so wrong. And that's what was going on. The women kind of became the priest's personal harem, if you will. All this in the house of God. And imagine God's thoughts. Imagine what God was thinking. We don't need to imagine, because verse 17 tells us, it says, the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. So this is our first setting. This is our first window into Samuel. All this sin, all this contempt for God, and its contrast, because the next verse starts out, but it's indicating right there, that one word, something's different. It's not going to be the same. We have all this sin, all this mess, all this disregard for God. But something else happening. Remember the kid? Remember Samuel? Samuel, okay. I don't think my clicker is working. Someone can flip that. Thank. One more. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Instead of blending in, Samuel stands out. This little kid in the priest outfit isn't like the priests at all. This wasn't an easy place to thrive. It wasn't an easy place for him to be faithful. But there he was. This is the first window, the first setting that we have. We have the unrepentant priest involved in unrestrained sin, and we have a young kid ministering faithfully to God. We have Eli's sons doing what's despicable in the sight of God, and little Samuel doing what's right. And this is the mess where Samuel was growing up. And everyone knew about it. His mom knew about it. Can you imagine? Eli the priest, he knew about it. There's a verse that says that all the people knew about it. And on in verse 22, it says, "Now Eli was very old, heard everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting." And Eli, he wasn't happy about this. Right? He was the high priest. He knew better, and he was upset. And so he calls his sons in, and he reprimands them. He gives them a reprimand. He chewed them out, but he didn't weed them out. See, he should have disqualified them. He should have kicked them out. He rebuked his sons, but he didn't remove his sons. And the verse goes on and says, "His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death." This blatant disregard for God, this doing what was not right, this unwillingness to accept discipline is the second window, the second contrast, because the next verse continues again. "And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and favor with the Lord and with people." See, this little kid, this young boy, he was starting to grow. He was growing physically. He was getting bigger. He was maturing. He was no longer a little kid. He was just a kid now. And he was gaining favor in the sight of the people. Those who would come to the temple, to the tabernacle, to sacrifice and worship, they were being taken advantage of by the priest. But this little Samuel, he was this bright spot. And when they would see him and they'd say, "Who's that kid?" Then someone would say, "That's Samuel." And they'd tell him of his faithfulness. And the people would go, "Yes, yes, that's what we've been waiting for. That's the relief we've been looking for." Samuel didn't blend in. Samuel stood out. And we may have some difficult environments ourselves, some places where it's very difficult to be faithful. But what about you? Do you blend in or do you stand out? In your social circles, in your community of people that you hang out with, that you see, are you a bright spot or are you like everyone else? And then we get to this third setting, this third window, starting in verse 27. "And a man of God," it says, "calls on Eli." Now, just that's kind of like, wait a minute. Eli's the high priest. Isn't he a man of God? And his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they're the priests. They should be men of God, right? But also we have a different man of God. And he comes. And he talks to Eli. And he tells Eli, he says, "Hey, God is saying that you're honoring your sons more than me." And in verse 29, the man of God declares judgment. Declares judgment on Eli and his family. And sometimes that bothers with us. It messes with us. It's like this vindictive God. That's why I don't like the First Testament. Right? God always seems angry. I don't know. Have you read Revelation? God doesn't change. And so there's something, though, here that love and discipline have to go hand in hand. They can't be separated. Right? If your child is acting up, your child probably doesn't act. If your grandchild is acting up, because see, for some reason, your the parents of your grandchild aren't near as good as parents as what you were. Right? So if your grandchild is acting up and needs some discipline, you don't say, "Oh, we don't discipline little Johnny because we love him. We don't discipline because we love him." We don't say that, right? If there is an Iowa football player who is stealing food, like the priests were, who is making sexual advances on women, and it's reported in the press, and they go to Curt and they say, "What about this player?" Coach Ferentz isn't going to say, "Oh, well, I don't discipline them. I love my players. I don't discipline them." Absolutely not. If he did that, he'd be coaching in a different conference and a different team, right? There's they go hand in hand, discipline and love. We we know that in our own lives, we know that with our children, but for some reason, when it comes to our spiritual life, we want to separate the two. We think that God should separate them. God loves his people, and this mess had gone on way too long. And God was saying, "Hey, time's up." He said, "I've tried multiple times. I've given you multiple warnings. I've come and you didn't listen, you didn't change, and there's going to be some punishment. Something bad is coming down." God tries to do that with us also. He tries. He tells us when we're not doing what he wants us to do. And we often respond and say, "Hey, God, just mind your own business. I'm quite all right here. I know what I'm doing. I don't need you to tell me what to do. I don't need your word to tell me what to do. Just love me." It's kind of the epitome of spiritual arrogance to believe that God is obligated to bless us no matter how badly we behave. That we can do whatever we want to do and God's going to answer our prayers. We think we can defy him year after year, and somehow he's obligated to continue to give us warnings. But if we reject him long enough, if we run away when he calls, if we plug our ears, a day is coming when we won't hear from him anymore. And that's where Hophni and Phinehas were. And yet, Samuel. Again, a contrast. All this sin, all these warnings against coming judgment and punishment. And Samuel, in chapter 3, it begins, "The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli." Samuel quietly doing what was right, what he was supposed to be doing. Hophni and Phinehas, they were loud, for lack of a better word. They're getting all the attention. If you just look at how much is written about them in chapter 2, you'd think they're the main characters. Right? All this stuff is written about them, and then Samuel gets part of a verse. He's quiet. He's faithful. Sometimes people who have good values and who show up with integrity and speak the truth, sometimes they're quiet. They don't try to grab attention. And we can look right over them, just like we can look right over Samuel. He just does what he does, ministering before the Lord. And that brings us to our final setting, this final window. And it happened at night. And it was dark. Eli was the chief priest. He was asleep. Samuel was asleep. Everybody was asleep. The kid, Samuel, he's asleep on a cot inside the temple. And the Lord called to Samuel, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel was startled. He was startled, and he runs to Eli. What could Eli need? And he runs to him, and he wakes him up, and he says, "You called me? What do you need?" And Eli, he's kind of groggy. He just woke up in the middle of the night, and he goes, "I didn't call you. Samuel, go back to bed." And so he does. And again, the Lord calls to Samuel, "Samuel, Samuel." And again, Samuel, he jumps out of bed, and he runs to Eli, and he says, I'm right here, Eli. What do you need? And Eli says, again, a second time, with a bit of frustration in his voice, he goes, just go. I didn't call you. Go back to bed and let me sleep. Right? If you get woke up by your kids a couple times in the night, you know what I'm talking about. And then a third time, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel gets up and he's trying to figure out why in the world is Eli still calling him? Why does he keep calling him? And then when he goes, he says he doesn't need anything. And Samuel, he runs over to Eli and he says, I'm right here. What do you need? And then Eli, he realized that it was the Lord calling the boy. And so Eli told Samuel, he said, go and lie down. And if he calls, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as the other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. See, Hophni and Phinehas, they had heard from the Lord, but they didn't want to hear. And so they turned him off. They wouldn't listen. Young Samuel, he's lying on his cot in the temple. And he said, speak, Lord, I'm listening. And God told Samuel, he said, Samuel, go and tell your boss that everything I prophesied against his family is going to happen. Eli and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they're going to be swept away. They're going to be removed. I told him I would judge his family because he knew about the sin, and his sons have blasphemed God, and Eli failed to restrain them. So remember, Eli knew what was going on. He knew what was going on with his sons. He knew about the junk, and he didn't stop it. But how do you think that young little Samuel spent the rest of the night? This kid, right? The scripture, it calls him a boy, not a man, not a young man, a boy. And this is a heavy message. I imagine it was a long and sleepless rest of the night for him. And I imagine he got up in the morning and little Samuel goes to do the duties he normally does to open up the doors of the tabernacle so that people could come in and worship. And I suspect that he was looking around trying to find ways to avoid Eli. Like, well, I'm going to go do this because he's over there. And then there's Eli. And Eli calls him over. Samuel, come here. Come here. And he says, what did God say? Tell me everything. I mean everything. Don't leave anything out. I want the whole thing. And young little Samuel, he looks up at Eli. He looks up at his father figure and he says, God said he's taking you down. Just like he's already told you. God is taking you down just like he already told you. That's a heavy message for a young kid to give to his spiritual leader. God had already given the message through the prophet. Why did he have to give it through Samuel? Why did he bring it through Samuel? Why did it have to be repeated? And why repeated through a kid? Well, partly for Samuel and partly for the people. Because up until this point, if you'd visited the tabernacle and you said, who's that kid? Who's that kid that's, faithfully serving? That little kid over there in the priest outfit? You would have said, that's Samuel. He's a priest in training, and he's going to be a good one. But now there was something different. Now, if you came to the temple and you said, hey, who's that kid? You said, that's Samuel. He's not just a priest in training, he's a prophet. God speaks through him to us. The people recognized that God was working through Samuel because of this. And if we listen, God will continue to speak to us. God was telling Samuel, hey, this environment that you've been in, you don't ever want to be a part of it. All of this evil that you've seen, that you've grown up around, all of this stuff, justice is coming, Samuel. You don't want to be a part of it. Stay faithful to me. And maybe Samuel needs to hear that to stay the course. Sometimes we tend to think that our behavior has no consequences because we don't get consequences right away. But we will get them. And then this goes on, starting in verse 19. It says, "The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his words." When Samuel speaks, it's with weight and with clarity and with accuracy. From that point on, everybody recognized that there was a prophet at Shiloh, and his name was Samuel. Samuel didn't blend in, he stood out. That's often what faithful people need to do. And the contrast in all four of these settings is disturbing to me, because Samuel and Hophni and Phinehas grew up in the same house, maybe 20 or 30 years apart, but they grew up with the same father figure. They grew up attending the same worship services. They sang the same songs. They said the same prayers. And they had radically different responses. And so, what about you? What is your response? What is God calling you to do? Is he calling you to do something? Or is he calling you to say, "Hey, I need your attention. We've got some things that need addressed"? And so I would encourage you to listen before he quits calling and before he begins the discipline. And this week, are you going to blend in, or are you going to stand out in your job, in your family, wherever you are? Because your age is irrelevant. If you're 85 and your life is winding down, faithfulness matters. If you're 45 and you're in the middle of life and things just they're not going quite the way you thought they were going to go. You thought, "Man, at this point I thought I was going to be there and I'm only here. Life has thrown me some curves I didn't expect." Faithfulness matters. If you're 25 and you're venturing out and you're looking at life ahead of you and you're excited about all the possibilities, faithfulness matters. Man, if you're a 6th grader or a 7th grader or an 8th grader, sometimes I hear people say, you're the church of tomorrow. You're the church of the future." Hogwash. You're the church today. If you are a follower of Jesus, if you're a professing Christian, you're the church of today. And faithfulness matters. Rowan Miller, I talked to him just briefly before. I'm really bummed, because a few weeks ago I was having lunch with Pastor Don, and I normally preach on the 4th Sunday of the month. And I knew that there were 5 Sundays coming up, and I knew that I'd already been asked to preach at Westchester on the 5th Sunday. And so I told Don, I said, "Hey, if you need someone else to preach that 5th Sunday, I could cover that Sunday." And Don said, "Oh, it's already covered." He says, "Rowan Miller is going to be preaching." And I'm like, "But I want to be there. I want to hear what he has to say." So I'm going to have to tune in later. But I'm bummed. I know you're not a kid. You're an adult, and your faithfulness matters. And here's what I want all of us in the congregation to do this week. I want all of us to pray for 2 things. I want us to pray for Rowan as he prepares a message. I want us to pray that he has the boldness of Samuel to speak exactly what God tells him, whether we want to hear it or not. That he says everything that God puts on his heart. And I want us to pray for ourselves, for the congregation, that our hearts are softened and that we hear and respond to what God is telling us through him. That we can respond to whatever God is telling us through Rowan. Because Rowan is not part of tomorrow's church. He's part of today. And he's willing to do one of the most difficult things, and that's to stand in front of people and tell them what God has put on his heart. So for all of us this week, whatever we encounter, remember the lessons of Samuel, that faithfulness matters. Stand up, stand out, don't blend in, and remain faithful no matter how difficult the circumstances.